Hello and welcome back to another episode of Math with Sohn. Today we are going to be learning about the distance formula. Let's get into it. So the distance formula is something that you can use to find the length between specifically two different points. And there are a lot of different formulas that they have. The one that I like the most is d squared equals x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. That is my distance formula of choice. Okay? Now there are a lot of other variants of this formula, but that's the one I like the most, and I want you to pay very close attention to the most intimidating part of that as y2 minus y1 and x2 minus x1. If you just look at those things, you'll realize that that's just really the slope formula kind of manipulated in a different way. All right? I also want you to take notice that this is really a more difficult way to look at the Pythagorean Theorem. And for those of you that forgot what the Pythagorean Theorem is, it is a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. The x2 minus x1 and the y2 minus y1 are the a and the b. They're just squared, and the c squared is the distance. All right? So, knowing that this is the Pythagorean Theorem, and knowing that the Pythagorean Theorem is probably a little easier to do, when you're given a graph, my recommendation is to draw a right triangle. So here we have this angled line. I'm going to go from the bottom point, I could have picked the top point, and go immediately towards this point by going as far to the left as needed. And that would be the bottom of my right triangle. And once I've aligned this up to a perfect vertical line, then I'm going to go up straight from there. And I have made that right triangle. So I'm going to count. This is to the left by 1, 2, 3. So this is 3. I'm going to count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to double check that. I went up by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So once I have that triangle made, that is my A and my B for the Pythagorean Theorem. The A and the B are interchangeable, so don't panic on that one. So I'm going to fill that into the Pythagorean Theorem. The distance formula is the Pythagorean Theorem, and the Pythagorean Theorem is the distance formula. So they are interchangeable depending on the scenario you're given. So 3 squared, that's my A, plus 6 squared, that's my B, is equal to c squared, which in this case we don't know. That's the distance, the d squared, or the distance. So 3 squared is going to be 9. 3 times 3. It's not 6. 6 squared is 36. 6 times 6 is 36, is equal to c squared. 9 plus 36 is 45, equals c squared. When we square root, we would have our answer. C, or the distance, is equal to the square root of 45. Now this, depending on what calculator you have, will either tell you a decimal or will simplify this radical. I like both answers, okay? If you don't have a calculator, you can leave it as square root of 45. If you have a calculator that simplifies it, or if you're in my honors class, I'm going to expect you to know how to simplify it. It would turn into 3 square root of 5. Number 2. If I want to find the length of AB, this time instead of being given a graph, I'm given points, okay? And if I'm giving points, I'm going to find the distance using this formula because this is the one that has a bunch of x's and y's. I could have used it here, but it's a little easier to count than to use the formula, I would think. So when you're given only points, you want to label your x1 and y1 and label your x2 and y2. I would have written it on top, but I just ran out of room. So once you have your x1 and y1 and x2 and y2, you can just plug them into the formula. So it starts out as x2 minus x1 in parentheses. Well, I want to start with my d squared. In parentheses, x2 minus x1. So x2 is 3 minus my x1 would be minus a negative 4. Fill in the squared. Don't forget the squared. That's probably a very important part. Don't forget the squared. So plus y2 minus y1. My y2 is negative 1. And my y1 is 1. And again, don't forget the squared. You're going to follow through with this math. So we're going to have to follow through with this math by doing 3 minus negative 4. If you have minus a negative, that turns into a positive. So it's really going to end up being 3 plus 4, which 3 plus 4 is 7. And it's still squared. Plus negative 1 minus 1. Well, negative 1 minus 1 is negative 2 squared. Don't forget that distance squared, the d squared. So we're going to type this into our calculator. And when we type it into the calculator, we end up with 7 squared, which is 49, and negative 2 squared. You need to make sure you are putting the negative numbers in particular, but all numbers you should be putting in parentheses just like I have it when you type it in your calculator, because negative 2 squared is 4, not negative 4. If you get negative 4, you messed up and you didn't put the parentheses. We add these two numbers together, and we end up with d squared is equal to 49 plus 4 is 53. And we would just have to square root the 53 to get our answer. And the square root of 53 doesn't simplify. So we square root here to get the square root of 53. Our third problem that we have here says find the length of EF. Well, we have 2 points again. So this is going to be just like the one we had above it. So this is just an extra example. Okay? So start off by labeling x1, y1, x2, y2. The letters go x comma y, x comma y. The 1s are because this is the first point. The 2s that I have here are because this is the second point. From there, we are going to continue to plug it into our distance formula that we have here. So d squared will equal, I'm going to write x2 minus x1. I'm just going to rewrite the distance formula. You don't have to. I recommend it sometimes if you're not really familiar with it. So I'm going to use this and plug it into my distance formula. We got 11 minus the negative 7, x2 minus x1. So x2 is 11 minus a negative 7. Don't forget the squared. Plus y2 is 3 minus a negative 2. 11 minus negative 7 is going to end up turning into 11 plus 7. Minus a negative is a plus. So this is really going to turn into 11 plus 7 squared. Plus 3 minus negative 2 is going to turn into a 3 plus 2 squared. Continue to follow through. We end up with 18 squared, and 3 plus 2 is 5 squared. So at this point, and actually at any point up here, we could have typed this whole thing into our calculator. We could have even typed this whole thing into our calculator. We could even just type this part all into our calculator, or we could do it separately. At any point, if you're like, I just want to type it in my calculator, you can, and it will type it all at the same time. You just got to be careful that you include the parentheses where they're supposed to be. All right? I'm going to do 18 squared. 18 and 18 multiplied together is a big number. It's 324. 5 squared, that's a little bit easier to handle. That's 25. Equals the distance squared. When you add these two together, you will end up with 349. And the square root of 349, I don't think square roots either. So I'm going to keep it as the square root of 349. All right. That's going to do it for this episode of Math with Sohn. Until next time, have a great day, and I will see you later. Bye.